Good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Find the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brung, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Just kind of a little bit of announcement. I'm going to be generally doing 2-week episodes, or every 2 weeks, I should say, every other week. There might be some exceptions here and there, particularly if there's something happening or present that definitely want to engage and talk about in a timely manner here with all of this. I'm doing something a little bit different than some of my other casts, but still within kind of that historical perspective, and wanting to use an example of a book called They Came Before Columbus of, bad history. And kind of shifting to exploring, again, something that was with good intent, or at least kind of came from the right place on how even ourselves, in wanting to deconstruct a white supremacist or a Eurocentric view of history, and a lot of times mishistory, can, replicate a lot of those same mistakes. And I'm going to be using this as an example of how we can better look at history, better explore the evolutions of history and engage with it, particularly as laymen. And because there's a lot of folks out there that make big monumental claims without providing a lot of evidence around history, saying this happened without providing citation, providing where they got it from. And also exploring it in an absolutist way of, this is, the white folks got it wrong, this was a lie, and this is the truth. And I guess in some of my own ways, I have been guilty of it. But I should say the times that I sound like it, it's much more coming from a place of kind of shift and change and studying it, because there really is no absolute in history. It's all different lenses and objective, or I should say subjective, truths combined together. And you have to look at this big picture and what we think happened, or what is looked at, or what the evidence tells us or suggests. And cut down as much of the inference as possible, assumptions, one-on-ones. What is written, if anything is written. What does it say? How is it being said? How is this being engaged? Particularly the last 200 years is a lot easier to engage with than even before that. So there's a lot of things that we can talk about in the last couple of 100 years with a lot more certainty and absolutist, mentality. Than before that. And so we have to really kind of start parsing these things out, particularly as we go deeper and deeper into the past of history. So that's what we're going to be doing. Thanks for coming. Okay, so they came before Columbus. And really the dangers of historical myth-making in an attempt to recapture our history, or lost history, as you will, particularly to colonialism and white erasure, as up until really the last, I'd say 30, 40 years, it seems the last 30 years there's been a major shift in history, historiography, how people have studied history, interpreted history, and engaged with it. It has evolved greatly from a lot of the stuff that came about in the 19th century and the 20th century. A lot of what even myself learned in school, I should say, what is known in the world of historians, or at least understood, and how they both engage and understand history, is vastly different than what and how we actually teach it in schools. Which is, it's a danger. We're still, our schools and social studies is still very antiquated and still very much behind the curve of where we see historians teaching. This has been the case, and I mean, even in learning about Columbus in elementary school for myself, this would have been in the early 90s. Historians knew and interpreted Columbus very different than how he was taught at that point. So again, the stuff takes time. So what you learn in school and how it's presented is vastly different than what our experts are talking about. Part of this is structural in the fact that historians publish in journals that are behind paywall walls, and these things aren't, lack of a better word, trickling down into our curriculum. It's getting better, but it isn't perfect. So that's kind of, a good basis for things. Much of what I'm pulling from, particularly I should say in the critique of They Came Before Columbus, has come from a couple of different journals. One called Robbing Native American Culture, Van Sertima's Afrocentricity and the Olmecs, from Current Anthropology, 38.3, year 1997, pages 419 to 441. And then They Were Not Here Before Columbus, Anthrocentric Hyperdiffusionism in the 1990s, out of the journal Ethnohistory, volume 44, number 2, spring of 1997. I was, sometimes you one of them I had to pay for, and another one I was able to catch for free, at least that section. And so I would say much of the critique that I'm pulling from is pulled from those two journals and articles or papers, however you want to think about them. How it's going to work, I'm going to walk through some of the major claims, present back against them, and then wrap back around into exploring how the author, Ivan Van Sertima of They Came Before Columbus, really went about this in a way that replicated Eurocentric history, particularly at this point. This was published in 1977. This was really at the turn of when the study of history started really to kind of take a turn for the better in American universities. And global universities as well. I don't want to, be American-centric here. But there was a lot of selective facts, factual omission, date scaling and date matching. Things just didn't match up, as well as presently, and things that really presented in the 90s, genetic evidence. And that's a tricky area, and we need to be careful with that, but we'll get there when we get there. So let's walk through with the major claims. One of the biggest ones is that the Olmec civilization was of African origin. This was originated by Leo Weiner, who lived from 1862 to 1939, and author Ivan seems to have popularized this. We still know very little about the Olmecs. And it's a mysterious civilization. They rose and fall, existed for a long period of time. And fall is even kind of a strange word, as there was Olmecs as, Europeans landed there. People were still there, and we could call it fall of civilization. It's just a change of what was to, now. Unfortunately, through disease and genocide, a lot has been lost since the first European contacts. But there's little that we know. Recent genetic research, which has really strengthened over the past, particularly 10 years, really the past 10 years. I mean, the last 20, 30 years has been quite a bit, but the past 10 years, it has really exploded in what we understand about the human genome, particularly through a anthropological and historical lens. Well, what we found is that pre-Columbians of Olmecs don't have any African genetics. What we see for genetic ancestry is closely related to Melanesians in Malaysia and indigenous populations out of Australia, which isn't something surprising if that we know about from indigenous American ancestry. And we're still learning a lot about the indigenous American ancestry for a lot of different reasons. Lot of different, some good, some bad, and that's complicated. We'll get to that too. But arguments often fall upon what I personally might describe as phrenology, looking at the statues and saying, well, those are African features. Well, you can also find other artwork and statues that might have more Asiatic features. But let's not use, statue artistic phrenology, right? To decide that that's of African origin. We know that there are people all across. In fact, you can find indigenous Australians that at times at first glance might look of African in origin, but they are Aborigine Australians. And we know the complexity of human migration is big too. That's a whole another thing to break down, particularly when we know through genetics again. But we just don't know a lot. And so these are claims that I don't think anyone can make just based upon looking at statues. That is irresponsible. It's bad history. It's bad study. It's just a major jump and assumption. We need to be careful about this. And say these were African features, particularly since a lot of the statues and masks that and archaeological evidence presented to find show, again, some of them look Asian in features. So what were they? We don't know. And I think that's the biggest thing is we just don't know. So let's not make an assumption of saying this, that, or third. But what we do know is we do have genetic evidence, and the genetic evidence does not back up this claim. So right now, we have what we don't know and what we do know. And what we do know at least suggests the evidence that we have suggests that the claim of African interactions with the Olmecs is, well, non-existence. And also, and he kind of moves on. And then there's a claim that Columbus identified indigenous people as black. Actually, this is flat out incorrect. Columbus never claimed this. In fact, in his journal, he said when he came across indigenous populations, some paint themselves black, and they are the color of the Canarians, neither black nor white. Some paint themselves white, others red, and others of what color they find. Some paint their faces, others the whole body. Some only round the eyes, others only on the nose. You get neither black nor white. And in fact, one of the claims the author brings on is a quote that's not actually from Columbus, but someone, a historian of that time period, who used Columbus's journal as one of his sources. This was Bartolome de la Casa. He used the word black and said that they had gold spears. Now, Van Sertima claims that this means they were African spears, and he says that the gold and silver breakdown the spears the Spanish knew were identical, but he doesn't provide any evidence to his claim. Doesn't provide any evidence that the Spanish broke down West African spears, that measured them to the point, and I mean it's just a claim because of within this historian the golden spears, and as well as this and Renaissance, I guess, historian Lacasse made an error in translating or in using a source from Columbus. Additionally, the same person used the word bronze, and Columbus also said they were bronzed. I've seen actually people use this part of the quote as proof that people that Columbus engaged with were of African descent. But there's a couple of things that we have to break down here. One, Columbus was a greatly narcissistic man who held on to the claim that he landed in India to the day he died. Let alone the fact that bronze can describe a variety of people's skin color from across the world, most of which are probably not African. The bronzed skin color, it doesn't describe black or African. There's a variety of people outside of Africa that you can say that exact same thing from. So again, it's a major jump from bronzed to African in origin to black. It's a major jump. We can't do that, particularly again because it erases millions of people and thousands of years of history of people that could be described as such that weren't African. We have people all over Asia and the Pacific, Australia, Middle East. We have Persians and Southwest Asians and indigenous people that could be described as Brahmins. There's another one that he talks about, and again, using bad history, the arrival of, he claims that a Mali king made it across the Atlantic, but he makes a lot of these casual connections, right? Such as the famous Mali king Mensa Musa, who on his trip to Mecca, his Hajj, distributed enough gold to break economies. Mentioned in Egypt that his predecessor set sail for across the Atlantic and never returned. There is no documentation of this in Mesoamerica that this person landed, and in fact, the king that is credited with this is actually a non-existent king. This part's funny. So there again, no evidence that a Mali king made it to the Americas. The book is attributed to this Mensa Abu Bakr II. There is no evidence this king existed. Musa's predecessor was actually Muhammad ibn Gao, and again, the Musa claimed on his Hajj he sailed across the Atlantic. Now, this misattribution to came from a European historian, Baron de Slane, who mistranslated Ibn Khaldun's text. A 19th century historian mistranslated text, which brought about a fake king that then, the author of They Came Before Columbus presented as this king. Again, not getting things actually right, making big historic claims. You better make sure your history is correct, double and triple check it. This is another thing where there's no genetic history or genetic evidence of. Again, get to the issues of genetics, because it doesn't necessarily mean that didn't happen, but the most important thing that we can conclude from this is that if indeed this Mali king made it to the Americas, there is no lasting genetic evidence, and there is no lasting connection between the Mali Empire and the Americas. Like that's the part that's important, because we know China. There's a Chinese dynasty that had a ship make it to the West Coast, but there's no solid connection. We knew Vikings made it, but there's no continued connection, right? So you can say somebody made it, but what is the continued connection of things? And that's the interesting part about history, particularly since the claims in this book are of African influence in Mesoamerican, South American, and Indigenous American history, and cross-cultural contribution. So these are basically there's a major claim that Egypt and Mali kingdoms greatly influenced Mesoamerica and South American history. And in fact, kind of one of the claims is that Egypt brought about the domestication, the civilization rise in Meso and South American history, which again just doesn't line up and is greatly problematic in its own right, insofar that it replicates the idea of the indigenous savage in America, in the Americas. And that's part of the problem, is that this line, because there's really even a worse line of thinking, one that claims Black folks are the original indigenous populations. I've seen this claim, and then Black folks were shipped to Africa and then shipped back to the Americas. There's even a worse theory that claims that the transatlantic slave trade didn't even happen, beyond the mountains of evidence. And in fact, this creates a continued erasure of indigenous history and indigenous populations. This is what Eurocentric history does. This is the practice of Eurocentric history, is the erasure of other people's achievements and history and accomplishments and making it their own. We can't replicate this. We cannot replicate this. This is how we replicate oppression, and we have to break free of this mindset and be careful the claims we make. Other things Van Sturmer claims, Phoenicians, made it, but there's really, again, no evidence of this. With the timeline doesn't even really even match up. There are claims around pyramids, which pyramids and triangles are structurally sound. It's a very strong structure to build. Not entirely easy, but it's structurally sound. So if you're making a big building, building a pyramid is going to make it structurally sound. But this timeline, so there's a claim that because there's pyramids in Mesoamerica, that means that the Egyptians or Africans helped, lend that knowledge. And the idea that Mesoamericans couldn't, develop this understanding of building complex structures on their own is deeply insulting in real ways. How would people feel if again, Europeans gave the knowledge to build the pyramids based upon some sliver of evidence? It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. Beyond this, Egypt was done building pyramids by about 1700 BC, 500 years before Mesoamerica started building their pyramids. And even then, stylistically, Egypt didn't use steps outside of early built pyramids, particularly the first one. Mesoamerica, was building these. I should say that the first pyramid was around 2600 BC. Mesoamerica was building a lot of their pyramids with steps, the step type of pyramid. Not all of them, but a lot of them. They had a great stylistic diversity amongst their pyramids. Also, the uses were quite different. Egyptians built them as tombs. Mesoamerica used them as temples and even more. And again, diversity of structural and cultural use. The cultural use just was not the same, beyond the timeline not matching up. There's stuff with mummies. But again, the idea that South America and Egypt both had mummies, it doesn't mean it's causation. Other cultures had mummies outside of Egypt. But here's the thing, except South American use of mummies appears predated Egyptian. And the styles, again, different process. It's wild. But again, and then even more with the timeline, the 25th dynasty, again, that claim jump-started the Olmecs, but their culture predates the 25th dynasty by hundreds of years, if not over 1,000. Now, Egypt probably could have sailed across the Atlantic if they were so inclined to. But more importantly, there's no documented evidence that they did. And what I mean by this is that Egypt, from really the start of documenting their own history, their own written word in hieroglyphs, from the first dynasty on, were meticulous record keepers. At first it wasn't as meticulous as you might think. For that time period, it was, and it only grew as time went on, and really through their occupation by Rome. But they were meticulous. If they sent an expedition, they probably would have documented it. Again, it's not to say that they didn't. There could be lost documentation, but if they did, there was no lasting connections. There's, nobody really came back, and so if they did, it wasn't a big deal. It was nothing. It didn't have lasting impact. And again, genetic record doesn't do this. So let's think through this process and how you can do it. One, the author of this book relied upon, a lot of times, racist researchers, racist historians, people like Columbus. And this part's important, is that as we read through history, oftentimes we are presented with one-sided view. Many facts might be right, others might be wrong, but we have to understand the time period that they're in, and that they are looking through a very specific type of lens. Europe was a diverse place, much less isolated than we think, but still quite isolated for their time period, particularly, as post-Rome, Europe became quite isolated, but not nearly as much as we imagine. And medieval Europe was breaking through this isolation of post-Roman Europe. So this is, again, something that we need to think through, and the lens. A great example of this is actually the history of Rome and barbarians. Barbarians were a quite diverse group, ethnically, stylistically, between nomads and semi-nomads and settled people. But Rome didn't really engage with the barbarians with curiosity. They painted them all a lot of same stylistically the same. The Goths, they called before they called them the Goths, labeled them, I'm forgetting exactly what, but a so-called barbarian tribe that they engaged hundreds of years earlier. They named them the same name early on. And the Goths weren't just the Goths at that point. There are a multitude of tribes and identities within what the Romans called the Goths that eventually became a Gothic identity based upon various types of happenings in the Roman Empire. But Rome wasn't too curious about folks beyond their area of rule and what made them tick. Maybe they should have been. That's a different kind of story. But also who we call the barbarians, this vast, diverse peoples, didn't have the written word. So all we know is through Roman eyes, which wasn't curious, and which was definitely colored by their own preconceived notions. And then again, archaeological evidence. But archaeological evidence doesn't tell us a lot. And this is kind of where Indigenous history comes in. Indigenous sites, people that these Europeans came across, they didn't believe that they could make these things. They would see evidence of civilizations and just dismiss them outright. And it's really interesting. The fact that they saw, particularly, as time went on, the United States, what we call the United States, is unsettled territory, and saw folks as savages. Again, this is how these things are perceived, and these are the lens that a lot of times our records tells us from. And unfortunately, because of genocide, a lot of Indigenous records have been destroyed or looted. Not all, but a lot. Which also is part of why our kind of blindness to Indigenous history. Myself, I'm just starting to really read about Indigenous history, particularly through an Indigenous lens. So I'm not going to really speak on much specifically about what's real or not per se, but kind of really walk us through of how we need to be careful about this. Again, genetically, evidence shows that first people arrived about 15,000 years ago. Some Indigenous people claim before. There is some evidence of some and growing evidence that there were people here before then. But it's hard to know how these different people intermingled. Genetically, there isn't real evidence of there isn't a lasting kind of genetic evidence of these pre-15,000 years ago people. Pre-Clovis point is what they call them. And so this is an unsettled area and one that geneticists are really trying to, not always successfully, but engage in a respectful manner. And particularly what's hard is that we also don't have a lot of genetic evidence, particularly of North American Indigenous peoples, for very real reasons. There's, of how jacked up white geneticists have been over the last 50 years and before that. So there's very real reasons about this needing to be careful. And so what are we left with in a lot of areas that don't have written word? A combination of artifacts left behind, which are large cultural markings such as tools and pottery, wide cultural, we can see that there's this kind of wide cultural base. But even then, that doesn't necessarily bring it down into details, such as you can, let's say, a few thousand years from now, start digging within present-day United States. We might be able to tell certain cultural signifiers that unified our culture, certain cultural things. But since a lot of biomaterial clothes, music may not last for a lot of different reasons, but may not last, we might not be able to tell the difference between Black Americans and white Americans in the lived reality, and both in society, cultural differences, lived cultural differences. Now, archaeological evidence might be able to tell us that there were people that were seen as lesser than, based upon where certain characteristics were, in housing and types of housing. And these are things that we can tell. But it becomes hard. It becomes hard to get past that level, that lived day reality, these ethnic and sub-ethnic, identities and differences, because culture isn't homogenous. You can look out today and we know culture isn't homogenous. There's a lot of differences. And so we have to understand this about the ancient world. It wasn't homogenous either. People that might have shared similar pottery and burial practices might have had different identifiers that separated them out. But we can't tell that. And again, we have to be careful about these things. And even then, what we also know is that similar types of advances in technology and ways of living, such as agriculture and the rise of agriculture, can happen multiple places at the same time. Just because it happened one place doesn't mean that another place can't independently figure this thing out. And most of the time, that's how things happen. A lot of the times, that's how things happened. Because also a lot of the times there was this cross-cultural exchange, but we also know there is typically evidence of this cross-cultural exchange because there's usually also genetic evidence of cross-cultural exchange. Because when we have cross-cultural exchange, there is usually genetic mixing. And this is, how you can usually trace populations is through these two types of things. And so then this is how we have to really parse through history. Again, it becomes dangerous to do these things, or to make absolutes. So this lands us back on the thing. Maybe there was contact. I don't want to absolutely say there was or wasn't. But what we can tell is that if there was contact, it did not leave behind genetic markings, and it did not leave behind clear indicators of archaeological exchange, of pottery and other ways of living. Now, there are some similarities that we can draw, but again, similarities doesn't necessarily mean a connection. I definitely understand the impulse to want to reclaim history, reclaim the importance and legacy of your history. But we have to be careful, again, not to replicate, this Eurocentric erasure. There's this wants to say, we were kings and queens, which isn't wrong, but we are also farmers. We were making textiles. We were workers. We were soldiers. We were slaves. Because even the European colonization of Africa in the beginning of the slave trade, what they did is they took advantage of existing cleavages within different cultures and civilizations and states and empires, and took advantage of those cleavages and spread even more divide and conquer and these existing things to then launch the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. And when I say this, it's not to say, African history is bad, but it's to expose the complexity of history. It can be easy to look at things through a rose-colored glasses to think about the great way back when of great African empires, mostly large land empires with vast amounts of gold and resources that eventually were conquered and stripped of those resources. It's the history of the world. But those empires, some were good, some were bad, most were in the gray. And we have to recognize that. They were human. And we have to recognize that and learn from that. Because there's some great books out there that explore these histories and these empires. And we're really only starting to reclaim some of this history within Africa and these stories. And there were some great things that were absolutely ripped away from us. And there are some not so great things that existed in most civilizations. And in fact, one of the first civilizations and one of the first cities, Uruk, in the Mediterranean, had concubines and slaves. It's what we call the first city. One of the first signs of civilizations, unfortunately, had slaves, or so-called civilization, if you want to talk about it. And how we look upon civilization is weird and strange. Because we might see more nomadic tribes as less civilized, but the Huns and indigenous people and people that we might look upon nomadic may not always been nomadic. The Huns are, again, a great example of some nomadic, some not, multi-ethnic, very diverse structures, state-like structures. These weren't primitive people in how we think about it, or at least how we think of primitive. Not, these weren't cavemen, and neither are indigenous people. So you can replicate some of these processes. And multiple things can be true at the same time, again. Truth doesn't erase the horrors of what Europeans wrought upon the world. We have to accept the messiness of humanity, the messiness of human history. And how much is us to learn and relearn and recorrect within ourselves and how we understand our past and deep past, and in fact our present as well. Because if we're not careful, we're going to continue this misunderstanding of ourselves and history and continue to rely upon unreliable narrators like Columbus. Because there's another great example, and that's of the Greek world, which we often attach to European history, which isn't entirely wrong, but the Greek world is seen as continental Europe. Historically, much of Greek history and the Greek people, or the diversity of Greek people and ethnicities and histories, right? In Sparta and Atlanta were Greek, but different, and it was a different time period, but they saw themselves as the Mediterranean world and really the Swana, or Southwest Asia, North African world. And they didn't engage with continental Europe. They engaged with the Mediterranean, the Persian, North Africa. That was their world. That was their cultural exchange. Not the tribes in Central and Northern Europe. Maybe a bit in the steppe, in Asia steppe, not a lot. But now it's viewed quite differently as part of the larger continental European history, even if it was much more of Southwest Asia and North African history and that part of the Mediterranean. Same with Rome. Rome's breadbasket wasn't what we now call France or Germany or England. It was North Africa. But really the main, my biggest gripe with this is the erasure of indigenous history and indigenous people in their own history. Again, we can't be doing that for our own wants and beliefs and desires to be important. Because there's more than enough of that importance to go around for every civilization. For every civilization, there are great things and great horrors. For every people, there are great things and great horrors. And we have to wrestle with that and accept our messiness. That is the only way we're going to start understanding ourselves better. It's by embracing that messiness. We've long been complex animals. Our complexity predates, in fact, our humanity, our human species. Clever, stupid, inventive, and more. We can assume reason, really based upon, again, our cultural identity and norms. We can't project these certain things. We see similarities and foreignness all around us. And we have to understand a lot of this is seen through a pinhole of what most history actually is. We've lost most history. And same with the genetic evidence, where there's going to be gaps. There's whole peoples that have left behind no lasting genetic evidence, because their bones are dust now. And they're gone. And their entire civilization is gone. No lasting genetic history either. So there's large things missing. But we can't project, again, our own wants and desires onto these blank spaces. We can work around the edges. We can pull back, see even a larger picture as best we can. But ultimately, there's going to be these holes. And we have to be careful of what we decided happened in those holes, because of how it reverberates through today and how we interact with each other, understanding ourselves as we try to reclaim so much that has been erased over the last few hundred years in our own histories. And that is how we should engage with history. Again, it's not an easy thing to do, particularly once we start moving past the last couple of hundred years. And even then, it's not always easy. But we need to be careful of, one, not replicating practices, making sure timelines holding up, making sure there's hard evidence before we make big claims. We can suggest things, we can talk about similarities, we can talk about certain things that we don't know, and we have to be okay with the things that we don't know. That is it for this week with Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. Be probably seeing y'all in a couple of weeks. Again, unless something really wild happens within this next week. But thanks for coming. And I hope y'all have a good one. Mask up. I might do a little movie review next time. We'll see. Anyways, have yourselves a good one. Thanks for coming.
This is 365 Media.